The front command decided to accelerate the advance of the main forces towards the Oder and to try and seize bridgeheads on the western bank on the march. To protect the main forces of the front moving towards the Oder from possible enemy blows in East Pomerania, we decided to turn the 3rd Shock Army, the 47th Army, the 61st Army, the 2nd Guards Cavalry Corps, and the 1st Army of Wojsko Polski to the front facing north. Sections of the 8th Guards Army, the 69th Army, and the 1st Guards Tank Army were left behind to deal with the garrison in Poznan. The 8th Guards Army, under the command of General Chuikov, was assigned to seize Poznan. It was initially believed that there were 20,000 troops surrounded in the city, but it actually turned out that there were over 60,000. Consequently, the fighting in the fortified city dragged on until February 23rd. According to our calculations, the enemy could not organize a counterblow from Pomerania before the front forces reached the Oder. If any serious danger arose, we still had time to regroup part of the forces from the Oder to counter the Pomeranian grouping. This is what later happened. After further consultations, the Supreme Commander consented to the Front Command's plan, instructing us to take good care of our right flank. As for reinforcements, he refused us any. The Supreme Command's concern about our right flank proved absolutely correct, as subsequent events showed that the threat from East Pomerania was building up. Our offensive was swiftly moving ahead. The main forces of the front, having knocked out isolated enemy units and crushed the resistance on the Miedzierzex fortified line, reached the Oder between February 1st and 4, seizing a very important bridgehead on the western bank in the area of Kustrin, Kostrazin. Here, it is important to dwell at some length on the heroic deeds of the 5th Shock Army, headed by Lieutenant General Bazarin and Lieutenant General Bokov, member of the Military Council. The advanced detachment of the 5th Shock Army played a key role in seizing the bridgehead. The detachment was led by Colonel H.F. Yesipenko, Deputy Commander of the 89th Guards Rifle Division, and Lieutenant Colonel D.D. Shaposhnikov, representative of the Military Council of the 5th Army and Deputy Chief of the Army's Political Department. The detachment consisted of the 1006th Rifle Regiment of the 266th Rifle Division, the 220th Detached Tank Brigade under Colonel A.N. Pashkov, the 89th Detached Heavy Tank Regiment, a Tank Destroyer Regiment, and the 489th Mortar Regiment. By the morning of January 31st, the advanced detachment had forced the Oder and seized a bridgehead in the area of Kienitz, Gross, Neuendorf, and Rehfeld. The appearance of Soviet troops only 70 kilometers from Berlin utterly astounded the Germans. At the moment the detachment burst into the town of Kienitz, German soldiers were blissfully walking the streets, and officers were sitting at a restaurant. Trains on the Kienitz-Berlin line were running on schedule, and communications were operating normally. Colonel Terekin, infantry battalion commanders Kravtsov, Platonov, and Cherednik, along with artillery battalion commanders Zharkov and Ilyashchenko, organized solid defenses at the bridgehead. Both officers and men realized that the Germans would do everything they could to drive the detachment back beyond the Oder. In the morning of February 2nd, the enemy launched a sweeping artillery and mortar attack on the positions held by the detachment. Soon after that attack, the Luftwaffe came. The bridgehead ground shook with the bursting of shells, mines, and bombs. The hurricane of fire raged for about an hour. Then enemy troops, supported by armour, attacked our advance detachment from 3 directions. Ignoring their heavy losses, the enemy stubbornly pushed ahead. Their armour even succeeded in breaking through to our artillery positions and destroying several batteries. The situation became critical. Enemy tanks threatened to emerge into the detachment's immediate rear, and once that happened, it would hardly be able to hold out. Things reached the point that Captain Kravtsov's battery had only 1 anti-tank gun left. The gun crew, under Senior Sergeant Belsky, engaged 8 enemy tanks. There were only 13 shells left. Belsky counted them again. Yes, only 13, and 8 tanks. "We'll fire point blank to cinch it," Belsky told his men. "We've got to stop the enemy, even if we die doing it." Senior Sergeant Belsky and his comrades, Kargin and Sheryusov, were experienced soldiers. The outcome of the battle depended on their fortitude and skill. They rolled the gun into a barn, smashed a hole in the wall, and set the gun for direct fire. They were under cover and could score broadside hits. The clanging of tracks was already audible. Senior Sergeant Belsky was behind the gun. The leading tank was no more than 150 m away, and the cross on its turret was plainly visible. As coolly as he could, Belsky drew a bead on the tank and waited. Fire. The shell hit the fuel tank, and at once red flames danced over the machine. The second shell also hit home. Another tank spun helplessly with a broken track. A minute later, a third tank burst into flames. This was real precision firing. Smoke rose over the 5 enemy tanks that had been stopped dead before our lines. The remaining 3 turned back. For his courage and valour displayed in that battle, Senior Sergeant Belsky received the Order of the Red Banner, and the rest of the crew received other awards. Following up the advance detachment, the 26th Guards Rifle Corps under Lieutenant General P.A. Firsov, with Colonel D.N. Andreev as chief of the political department, began expanding the bridgehead. The Corps' 94th Guards Division, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel B.I. Baranov and chief of the political department Colonel S.V. Kuzovkov, forced the Oder. The 286th and 283rd Guards Regiments engaged and overran the enemy at the bridgehead. The division's 199th Guards Artillery Regiment fought courageously in that battle. Lieutenant Colonel I.F. Sherebtsov, commander, and Major 6th Oryabinsky, his deputy for political affairs. Senior Lieutenant Mironov's battery fought with particular skill. During an enemy attack, Battery Commander Mironov was wounded, and Senior Lieutenant Avelichev took over for him. Together with the infantry, the battery beat off 6 enemy attacks that day. Senior Sergeant Shvetsov and Sergeant Volkov, leaders of the battery party organizations, were especially dauntless. The officers and men of the 2nd Battalion of the 1050th Rifle Regiment, Battalion Commander F.K. Shapovalov, his deputy for political affairs I.F. Osipov, displayed mass heroism. Under adverse conditions, they beat off attack after attack by the enemy's infantry and armour. The officers and men of the 3rd Battalion under A.F. Bogomolov were truly magnificent. Although severely wounded, the commander refused to leave the battleground and continued directing the action of his troops. Bogomolov died and was posthumously awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union for his heroism and valour. All officers, NCOs and men of the 1st Battalion of the 1008th Rifle Regiment received orders or medals for that action. Battalion Commander M.A. Alexiev and Senior Lieutenant Kulinur Usenbekov, Battalion Party Leader, were awarded the high title of Hero of the Soviet Union. The Order of Suvorov, 3rd Class, was conferred on the 1008th and 1010th Rifle Regiments of the 266th Division for their mass heroism. The men of the 1054th Regiment, the 301st Rifle Division, under Lieutenant Colonel N.N. Radayev, fought for several days in sustained battles. Thanks to their advantageous positions on the heights and their earlier entrenchment in the brick houses of the area, the enemy was able to hold out against the advancing regiment. All the approaches to the enemy defences that Radayev's regiment was to break through were kept under heavy enemy fire from all sorts of guns. The Soviet troops had to wade across terrain waterlogged by melting snow. At dawn, our guns opened fire along the whole sector. Soviet artillery targeted trenches, previously detected points, and other Nazi firing positions. Almost immediately afterwards, the regiment units went into attack. As always, Communists and young Communist League members were in the front lines. Lieutenant I.F. Sinichkin, Komsomol organizer of the 3rd Rifle Battalion, led his men into the attack and fought with distinction. During the attack, our troops drove the enemy out of the trenches and eliminated 2 defensive positions. However, the enemy soon regained their composure, concentrated their forces, and began a counterattack. In one sector, they were even able to break through and push us back. However, the Germans were unable to get very far. The 3rd Battalion struck a powerful blow, crushed them, and successfully continued the offensive. For his courage and valour in this battle, Sinichkin was awarded the Order of the Red Banner. The heroism displayed by the men of the 1008th and 1009th Regiments helped ensure that the Soviet bridgehead remained intact. The determination to seize the bridgehead on the western bank of the Oder in the Kustrin area was of enormous strategic importance. This achievement by the 5th Shock Army of the First Belarusian Front opened the way for a thrust into the heart of the enemy's defences. During the battles for the Oder, our men displayed remarkable fortitude and bravery. The defenders of the bridgehead held firm under the enemy's furious bombardment. They fought heroically, and their tenacity ensured that the enemy's attempts to drive them back to the river failed. It is worth noting that in the course of these operations, the 5th Shock Army had forced the Oder and expanded the bridgehead, helping to establish the conditions for the decisive assault on Berlin. From there, they were to heighten the offensive on the Berlin sector, directing their main effort towards skirting Berlin to the northeast, north, and northwest. The Supreme Command endorsed this plan on January 27th. On January 28th, Marshal Konev, commander of the 1st Ukrainian Front, submitted a similar plan to the Supreme Command. Essentially, it involved knocking out the Breslau grouping, reaching the Elbe by February 25th or 28th, and having the right flank forces, in coordination with the 1st Belarusian Front, capture Berlin. This plan was also endorsed by the Supreme Command on January 29th. Chuikov is correct in stating that at the time, the enemy had limited strength at the approaches to Berlin, and their defences were rather weak. This was clear to us. Consequently, the command of the front issued the troops the following orientation: attention of military councils of all armies, commanders of fighting services, and the chief of rearguard forces. Below are tentative calculations for the immediate future and a brief situation estimate. 1. The enemy confronting the 1st Belarusian Front has, up to now, no sufficiently large groupings for a counterattack. 2. The enemy has no permanent line of defence either. They are currently protecting several directions and trying to organise mobile defence in various sectors. 3. According to preliminary information, the enemy has removed 4 tank divisions and 5 or 6 infantry divisions from their western theatre and is moving them to the eastern theatre. At the same time, the enemy is continuing troop transfers from the Baltic area and East Prussia. 4. In all probability, in the next 6 or 7 days, the enemy will deploy the incoming forces along the Schwedt-Stargard-Neustetten line to cover Pomerania and deny us Stettin and access to the Pomeranian Bay. 5. The forces being transferred from the west will evidently be deployed in the area of Berlin to cover the approaches to the city. 2. The task of the front forces for the next 6 days is to consolidate the gains through vigorous action, bring up everything that needs bringing up, replenish supplies to a double supply of fuel and 2 sets of ammunition, and capture Berlin on February 15th or 16th through sweeping assaults. To consolidate the gains between February 4th and 8th, it is necessary: A. For the 5th, 8th, 69th and 33rd Armies to seize bridgeheads on the western bank of the Oder. It is preferable for the 8th Guards and the 69th Armies to have a common bridgehead between Kustrin and Frankfurt. If possible, it would be beneficial for the bridgeheads of the 5th and 8th Armies to merge. B. For the 1st Army of Wojsko Polski, the 47th and 61st Armies, the 2nd Tank Army, and the 2nd Cavalry Corps to push the enemy back beyond the Ratzeburg-Falkenberg-Stargard, Altdam River-Oder line. After that, they should leave a covering force until the armies of the 2nd Belarusian Front pull up, and then redeploy along the Oder for a breakthrough. C. To complete the liquidation of the Poznan-Schneidermühl enemy grouping by February 7th or 8th. D. To note that reinforcement means for the breakthrough will be the same as what the army possesses today. E. For tank and self-propelled artillery units to restore to service materiel currently in running and medium repair by February 10th. F. For the Air Force to complete deployment and ensure at least 6 fuel refilling supplies are available at the airfields. G. For the front, army and immediate rear units to be in full readiness for the decisive phase of the operation by February 9th or 10. Signed, Zhukov, Telegin, Malinin. However, as pointed out before, the danger of a counterblow from East Pomerania against the flank and rear of the front's main force advancing towards the Oder began to loom large in early February. Field Marshal Keitel stated during an interrogation, "In February and March 1945, it was planned to launch a counteroffensive against the forces advancing on Berlin, using Pomerania as the jumping-off place. It was expected that having established cover in the area of Grudziądz, Graudenz, the army group Vistula would break through the Russian lines and, moving along the Vorta and Netza river valleys, approach Kustrin from the rear." This thinking is also confirmed by Colonel General Guderian. In his Memoirs of a Soldier, he writes, "The German command was going to deliver a shattering counterblow with lightning speed by the army group Vistula before the Russians had time to bring up large forces or had guessed our intentions." The cited testimony by military leaders of fascist Germany proves beyond all doubt that the danger from East Pomerania was very real. However, the command of the First Byelorussian Front took the decisive countermeasures required. Operating between the Oder and the Vistula in early February were the German 2nd and 11th Armies, which had 22 divisions, including 4 tank and 2 motorized divisions, 5 brigades, and 8 combat groups. According to our intelligence, replacements kept coming up to the area. Besides, the 3rd Panzer Army was deployed in the Szczecin area, which the German command could use either to protect the Berlin direction or to reinforce the East Pomeranian grouping. The latter, in fact, happened. How could the Soviet command take the risk of continuing the Berlin offensive with such a grave danger looming in the north? Chuikov writes, "As for risk, it has often to be taken in war, and in that particular instance the risk was well worth taking. During Operation Vistula Oder, our troops had covered over 500 kilometers, and only from 60 to 80 kilometers stood between the Oder and Berlin. Of course, we could have ignored the danger and let both tank armies, along with 3 or 4 field armies, move straight toward Berlin and come close to the city. However, the enemy, striking from the north, could easily have broken through our cover and gained the passages across the Oder, putting our forces near Berlin in an extremely difficult position. War experience shows that taking risks is advisable, but one should not overreach oneself. In this respect, the lesson learned by the Red Army during the Warsaw Offensive in 1920 is very instructive, as its headlong, unprotected advance led, instead of success, to the overwhelming defeat of our Western Front. If we objectively estimate the strength of the Hitlerite grouping in Pomerania, Chuikov writes, we see that any threat from it to our striking grouping on the Berlin sector could be successfully localized by the forces of the Second Byelorussian Front. Facts contradict this contention. Initially, the task of routing the enemy in East Pomerania was supposed to be the sole responsibility of the forces of the Second Byelorussian Front. However, their strength proved to be totally insufficient. The offensive of that front, begun on February 10th, proceeded very slowly. Its troops covered only 50 to 70 kilometers in 10 days. At that moment, the enemy launched a counterattack south of Stargard and even succeeded in pressing our troops back, gaining some 12 kilometers southward. In view of the situation, the Supreme Command decided to move 4 field and 2 tank armies from the First Byelorussian Front to eliminate the East Pomeranian grouping, whose strength had by then grown to 40 divisions. Joint operations by the 2 fronts to knock out the East Pomeranian grouping were completed only towards the end of March. You can see what a tough nut that grouping was. Chuikov believes that the First Byelorussian and the First Ukrainian fronts could detach from 8 to 10 armies, including 3 or 4 tank armies, to advance on Berlin in February 1945. This claim is also disputable. At the beginning of February, of the 8 field and 2 tank armies of the First Byelorussian Front, only 4 short-strength armies remained on the Berlin sector: the 5th Shock, half of the 8th Guards, the 69th and the 33rd Armies. The rest of the forces had been diverted to East Pomerania to crush the enemy grouping there. As for the First Ukrainian Front, between February 8 and 24, it was conducting an offensive operation northwest of Breslau, Wrocław. The main forces of that front, 4 field, 2 tank, and the 2nd Air Army, were engaged. The enemy had moved up considerable forces and was offering stubborn resistance. In 17 days of the offensive, the First Ukrainian Front forces gained 100 kilometers and reached the River Nisa. Attempts to force the river and accelerate the offensive westward were unsuccessful. Consequently, the forces of the front assumed a defensive position along the east bank of the river. It should also be noted that our strength had been considerably sapped during Operation Vistula Oder. As of February 1st, infantry divisions were, on average, 5,500 strong. For instance, the 8th Guards had only between 3,800 and 4,800 officers and men. The number of tanks in the 2 tank armies was 740, averaging 40 per brigade. However, many brigades had only 15, 20 tanks. The situation was approximately the same with the First Ukrainian Front. To add to the challenges, the fortress and the city of Poznan, deep in the rear of the front, were still held by the enemy. Chuikov's army did not capture them until February 23rd. The problem of logistical support should not be overlooked either. In 20 days, our troops advanced more than 500 kilometers. Naturally, at this rate, logistical establishments fell behind, and the troops were short of supplies, especially fuel. Similarly, the Air Force could not redeploy either, because a rainy spell had turned all the airfields into bogs. Chuikov, who had not analysed the complexity of the logistical situation, writes, "Had General Headquarters and Front HQs organised supplies properly, so as to have sufficient amounts of ammunition, fuel and provisions on the Oder, had the Air Force redeployed in time to airfields near the Oder, and the pontoon bridge building units ensured passage across the Oder, 4 of our armies, the 5th Shock, the 8th Guards, the 1st and 2nd Tank, could, in early February, have stepped up the Berlin offensive further and, gaining another 80 or 100 kilometres, completed that mammoth operation by taking the German capital on the march." This, if so-and-so had, speculation cannot be considered serious, even for a writer of memoirs. However, Chuikov's admission that supplies were disorganized and that the Air Force and pontoon bridge-building units had lagged behind indicates that, under the circumstances, it would have been utterly adventurous to launch a decisive offensive on Berlin. It follows that neither the First Ukrainian nor the First Byelorussian fronts could conduct the Berlin operation in February 1945. Chuikov writes, "On February 4th, the commander of the First Byelorussian Front called army commanders Berzarin, Kolpakchi, Katukov, Bogdanov, and myself to the headquarters of the 69th Army, where he had just arrived, for a conference. We were already sitting at tables discussing the plan of the Berlin offensive when a call came over the radio telephone. I sat practically next to the RT set and could hear the conversation well. It was Stalin calling. He asked Zhukov where he was and what he was doing. Marshal Zhukov replied that he was in conference with army commanders at the headquarters of Kolpakchi's army, planning the Berlin offensive with them. After listening to the report, Stalin told the commander of the front, and I understood it came as a surprise to him, to stop planning the Berlin offensive and start working out an operation to deal with the German army group Vistula in Pomerania. However, there was no such conference at the headquarters of the 69th Army on February 4th. For that reason, there could not have been any RT conversation with Stalin, about which Chuikov writes. On February 4th and 5, I was at the headquarters of the 61st Army, which was deployed on the right wing of the front in Pomerania for action against the Pomeranian grouping. Nor could commander of the 1st Guards Tank Army Katukov have been at that mythical conference either because, following a front directive of February 2nd, 1945, number 00244, he had been conducting the redeployment of troops from the Oder to the area of Friedberg, Berlinchen and Landsberg since the morning of February 3rd. As well, the commander of the 2nd Guards Tank Army Bogdanov could not have been there either because he was ill. General Radzievsky was then acting commander. As for Chuikov himself, on February 3rd he was in Poznan, from where he sent me a message on the progress of fighting for the city and the fortress. Chuikov's memory must have failed him. It should be pointed out that only half the units of Chuikov's 8th Guards Army came up to the Oder. The rest were engaged in Poznan until February 23rd. After some of the front's forces were drawn off to Pomerania, there were, in fact, 3.5 armies left on the Oder in the Berlin sector, and in early February the situation began to get complicated. On February 2nd and 3, the Luftwaffe continually bombed the combat formations of Berzarin's 5th Shock Army at its bridgehead on the Oder. During those 2 days, the German aircraft flew over 5,000 combat missions, inflicting heavy losses on the 5th Army. The enemy was trying to eliminate the Kustrin bridgehead at whatever cost. Units were brought up from other fronts. The commander of the 5th Army, Berzarin, asked for more air support. However, the weather prevented our air force from active operations. One of my telegrams to the Military Council of the 5th Army will provide an idea of the situation that had developed. Attention of the Military Council, Corps Commanders and Division Commanders of the 5th Shock Army. The 5th Shock Army has been assigned an especially important mission, that of holding the bridgehead on the west bank of the Oder and expanding it at least up to 20 kilometres in frontage and 10 or 20 kilometres in depth. I ask that you all understand your responsible historic role in carrying out your mission and, after explaining this to your men, to demand that they display the utmost fortitude and courage. Unfortunately, we cannot yet help you with aircraft because all the airfields have turned into bogs and the planes cannot take off. Enemy planes are flying from Berlin aerodromes with concrete runways. I recommend 1. To dig in deep, 2. To organize massive anti-aircraft fire, 3. To move to night combat operations, launching each attack with a limited objective, 4. To repulse enemy attacks during the day. In another 2 or 3 days, the enemy will be washed out. I wish you and your troops historic success, which you not only can but must ensure. G. Zhukov. Chuikov claims that it was he who first raised the issue of the possibility of capturing Berlin in February 1945 at a military science conference in Berlin later that year, but that the issue was not properly considered when he first raised it. This question was certainly raised at the conference, only not by Chuikov, but by Major General S.M. Yenyukov, a representative of the General Staff. As far as I can remember, and as can be seen from the stenographic records of his report, Chuikov did not say a word on the subject. But to get back to the events of March 1945, the 2nd and 1st Byelorussian fronts completed the East Pomeranian operation and wiped out the enemy grouping. By late March, they had occupied all of East Pomerania. In February and March, the 1st Ukrainian front carried out 2 operations in Silesia, and by the end of March had reached the Neisse, coming abreast of the 1st Byelorussian front forces, which by then had gained the Oder. As a result of Operation Vistula-Oder, most of Poland was liberated, and the fighting carried over to German soil. 60 German divisions had been knocked out. To build up a new defence line on the Berlin sector, the German command had to bring up 29 divisions and 4 brigades drawn off from other sections of the Soviet German front, the Western Front, and from the Italian front. The Soviet offensive between the Vistula and the Oder is a brilliant example of a powerful strategic offensive operation, which proceeded without any pauses at an average rate of advance of 25 to 30 kilometres a day and 45 kilometres by tank armies, up to 70 kilometres on some days. This pace was the most rapid ever attained in the course of the Great Patriotic War. The large scale of the strategic operation and its rapid pace were above all the result of the improved general situation on the fronts, the excellent fighting spirit of the Soviet troops, the favourably changing balance of forces, and the further accumulation of combat, operational and strategic expertise. The decisive role in exploiting the success after the breakthrough was played by tank armies and detached tank and mechanized corps. In cooperation with the Air Force, like a fast-moving ram of colossal power, they cleared the way for the field armies. Once they entered the breach, tank armies and mechanized corps stepped up the offensive without a let-up day and night, giving the enemy no respite. Powerful advance detachments made deep thrusts and did not engage in prolonged engagements with individual enemy groupings. In close cooperation with the Air Force, tank armies and detached tank corps used swift thrusts to break the crust of enemy defense, cut his communication lines, seized passages and road junctions, demoralized the enemy, and disorganized his rear. By striking deep into the enemy rear, the Soviet armor prevented the German troops from utilizing most of their permanent solid defenses. After his fortified lines on the Vistula were breached, and until the time the Soviet forces reached the Poznan meridian, the enemy could not make a firm stand on even one of his deliberately organized positions. The plan to deceive the enemy that had been worked out by the Soviet command for Operation Vistula-Oder was totally successful, and the element of operational and tactical surprise was achieved. There are many statements by captured officers and men that show the German command had no idea whatsoever of our plans when our offensive began. Here are some of those statements. Captain Petzold stated, "I am positive that even on January 14, 1945, the German command did not know even the direction of the Russian main effort. Nor did they know the Russian strength." Senior Lieutenant Hans Wissinger stated, "From our experience of past years, we were convinced that this year the Russians would also take the offensive in winter. The German command counted on that. However, the start of the offensive showed that our command was, in any case, unaware either of the scope of this offensive or its principal objective." Senior Lieutenant Kosfeld stated, "The German command expected a Russian offensive at the end of December 1944. Later, officers often said it would start before January 15, 1945. The exact date of the offensive, however, was never known. Each shot from our side made the enemy jump, of course. He was expecting us to strike, although he had no idea of the scope of our offensive, and evidently counted on our launching it from the bridgeheads, for there would hardly be anyone in favour of starting a major offensive with the forcing of a river as mighty and wide as the Vistula, and extending the initial phase. True, there were analogous suggestions coming from some of the front's operation officers. Those officers considered that the enemy had deeply organized defenses directly in front of our bridgeheads, whereas other sections on the Vistula were used only as covering. But to adopt that plan would mean forcing a kilometre-wide river under utterly adverse conditions, where it was impossible to bring armour, that most important instrument of breakthrough, into action immediately. Mobile troops and most of the artillery could not then be ferried across fast enough to ensure a swift advance. It goes without saying that jumping off from the bridgeheads involved a considerable disadvantage. Enemy artillery and air force could punish us severely. But we had planned formidable counter-artillery and airstrikes. As far as supplies are concerned, Operation Vistula-Oder was organized well. The logistical agencies of the front and armies had done an excellent job. However, by the time our troops reached the Miedzierzek's fortified line and the so-called Pomeranian Rampart, the armies began to run short of fuel and lubricants and of the more urgently needed ammunition. There were several reasons for this, mainly that we were advancing twice as fast as had been envisaged. Rear communications lines stretched hundreds of kilometres, while the main railway lines were still out of operation because of the vast damage done to them, and there were no railway bridges across the Vistula. From the information furnished by the Supreme Commander and the General Staff, I knew that during January, February and March, the troops of the 4th Ukrainian Front were advancing in the Carpathians, assisting the 1st Ukrainian Front in carrying out its missions. Meanwhile, in January, February and the first half of March, the forces of the 2nd and 3rd Ukrainian fronts were fighting defensive battles, repulsing the enemy who tried to throw them back beyond the Danube and relieve his forces blockaded in Budapest, and thereby strengthen the Hungarian sector of his front. In bitter fighting, the 2nd and 3rd Ukrainian fronts inflicted a shattering defeat on the enemy striking forces, foiling all their attempts to reach the Danube. By mid-March, they had created conditions enabling us to go on to the offensive on the Vienna sector. Between March 16th and April 15th, the forces of the 2nd and 3rd Ukrainian fronts carried out the Vienna offensive operation, routing over 30 divisions of the Army Group South. By mid-April, our troops had liberated all of Hungary and much of Czechoslovakia. They had entered Austria and liberated Vienna, gaining access to the central regions of Czechoslovakia. Germany finally lost its oil wells in Hungary and Austria, as well as many munitions and military supply factories. Between January and April 1945, as a result of operations by the 2nd and 3rd Ukrainian fronts, our southern strategic flank was brought forward abreast of the fronts on the Berlin sector. Having reached the eastern bank of the Oder and the Neisse from the Baltic Sea down to Görlitz and protected the flanks, the Soviet troops had advantageous jumping-off positions for the final defeat of the Berlin grouping and the storming of Berlin. On the left flank of the Soviet-German front, our troops, after reaching the area of Vienna and south of it, took up advantageous positions for advancing deeper into Austria and the southern regions of Germany. On the western theatre, the armed forces of our allies forced the Rhine in February and March and surrounded a sizable German force in the Ruhr. On April 17th, the encircled troops surrendered. After the main German forces were destroyed on the Soviet-German front and the Allies had crossed the Rhine, Nazi Germany faced its doom. It had no strength left to continue fighting. As the end of the war drew near, several political issues in our relations with the Allies became exacerbated. This should have come as no surprise. The former sluggishness in the actions of the Anglo-American command was replaced by utmost haste. The governments of Great Britain and the USA were prodding the command of the expeditionary forces in Europe to demand that the Allied troops advance faster into the central parts of Germany to occupy them before the Soviet army moved in. Churchill wrote to Roosevelt on April 1, 1945. The Russian armies will no doubt overrun all Austria and enter Vienna. If they also take Berlin, will not their impression that they have been the overwhelming contributor to our common victory be unduly imprinted in their minds? May this not lead them into a mood which will raise grave and formidable difficulties in the future? I therefore consider that from a political standpoint we should march as far east into Germany as possible, and that should Berlin be in our grasp, we should certainly take it. I later learned that the British command and several American generals had done everything to ensure that the Allied forces would capture Berlin and areas to the north and south. In the course of the East Pomeranian operation, most likely on March 7th or 8th, I had to urgently fly to the general headquarters on the order from the Supreme Commander. Straight from the airfield, I went to Stalin's country house where he was staying. He was not in the best of health. Stalin asked me a few questions about the situation in Pomerania and on the Oder, heard out my answers, then said, "Let's stretch our legs a little. I feel sort of limp." From the way he looked, talked, and moved, you could tell that he was extremely fatigued. After 4 years of war, he was utterly overworked. He had worked overly hard and slept too little all that time, taking reverses, particularly those of 1941 to 1942, close to heart. All was bound to tell on his health and nervous system. As we were strolling through the park, Stalin unexpectedly began telling me about his childhood. We spent at least an hour chatting. Stalin then said, "Let's get back and have tea. I want to talk something over with you." On our way back, I said, "Comrade Stalin, I've been meaning to ask you for a long time about your son Yakov. Have you heard anything about him?" Stalin did not answer at once. We took a good 100 steps before he said in a subdued voice, "Yakov won't be let free. The fascists will shoot him first. From what we know, they are keeping him separate from the other POWs and are putting pressure on him to betray his country." Stalin was silent for a minute, then said firmly, "No, Yakov will prefer any kind of death to betrayal." It was obvious that he was deeply worried about his son. At the table, Stalin sat silent for a long time, not touching his food. Then, as though continuing his thoughts aloud, he said bitterly, "What a terrible war! How many lives of our people it has carried away. There are probably very few families left who haven't lost someone near to them. Only the Soviet people, tempered in battle and imbued with great spirit by the Communist Party, could endure trials and tribulations of this magnitude." Stalin then told me about the Yalta Conference. I understood that he was pleased with the results and thought very highly of Roosevelt. Stalin said that he was still trying to get the Allies to take the offensive to finish off Nazi Germany more quickly. By the time of the Yalta Conference, our troops had reached the Oder and were fighting fierce battles in East Prussia, the Baltic, Hungary, and other areas. Stalin had insisted that the Allies, who were 500 kilometers from Berlin, mount an offensive. An agreement was reached, and after that, the coordination of action between both sides considerably improved. Stalin told me at length about agreements with the Allies concerning the administration of Germany after its capitulation, about the control mechanism in Germany, the occupation zones into which its territory would be divided, and what was to be the link-up line for the Soviet and Allied forces. He did not allude to the details of the organization of the control mechanism or of the supreme power in Germany. I was briefed on that much later. Complete agreement had been reached as to Poland's future western borders, which were to be along the Oder and the Neisse, west. However, there was a great difference of opinion on the composition of the future Polish government. Churchill wants the Soviet Union to share a border with a bourgeois Poland, alien to us, but we cannot allow this to happen, Stalin said. We want to have, once and for all, a friendly Poland with us, and that's what the Polish people want too. Somewhat later he added, Churchill is out to groom Mikolajczyk, who has spent over 4 years sitting it out in Britain. The Poles will not accept Mikolajczyk. They have made their choice. Poskrebyshev entered the room and handed Stalin some papers. After skimming through them, the Supreme Commander said to me, You will now go to the General Staff and look through the calculations for the Berlin operation with Antonov. We'll meet here tomorrow at 13 o'clock. Antonov and I spent the rest of the day and a good half of the night in my office. He also told me many interesting things about the Yalta Conference. Once again, we considered the main points of the draft plan and the calculations for the Berlin strategic operation, which was to be carried out by 3 fronts. Since it had been discussed several times by the Supreme Command and at the General Staff, we only made those revisions that were necessary because of the extended operations in East Prussia, in the Danzig area, and in the Baltic. The next morning, the Supreme Commander telephoned Antonov to tell us to come at 20 o'clock instead of 13 o'clock. At the discussion of the Berlin operation that evening were several members of the State Committee for Defense. Antonov made a report. The Supreme Commander approved all of our proposals and instructed us to issue necessary orders for the full preparation of the offensive operation in the Berlin strategic direction. As the concluding operation of the Second World War in Europe, the Berlin operation is particularly important. The taking of Berlin finally resolved many major military and political questions on which Germany's post-war settlement and its place in Europe's political life largely depended. Preparing for the last battle with Nazism, the Soviet armed forces strictly adhered to the policy of Germany's unconditional surrender agreed upon with the Allies, both in military, economic, and political fields. At this stage in the war, our main aim was completely to root out Nazism in Germany's social and government system, and strictly punish all major Nazi criminals for their atrocities, mass-scale murders, destruction, and outrages committed against the peoples in the occupied countries, particularly on our long-suffering land. The plan of the Berlin operation basically shaped up at the Stavka in November 1944. It was specified in the course of the Vistula-Oder, East Prussian, and Pomeranian operations. In elaborating the plan of the Berlin operation, account was taken of actions by the Allied Expeditionary Force, which had reached the Rhine on a wide front in late March, early April 1945, and began to force it in order to launch a general offensive into the heart of Germany. The Supreme Command of the Allied troops had set itself the immediate objective of routing the enemy group and occupying the Ruhr industrial area. Then it intended for the US and British troops to advance to the Elbe River in the Berlin sector. At the same time, operations by US and French troops were developed in the southerly direction with the aim of capturing the Stuttgart and Munich areas and reaching the heartlands of Austria and Czechoslovakia. despite the fact that the boundary of the Soviet occupation zone was to pass far to the west of Berlin according to the Yalta Conference agreements, and that the Soviet forces were already on the Oder and the Neisse rivers, 100 kilometers from Berlin, and were ready to launch the Berlin operation. The British government, with Winston Churchill at its head, still dreamed of capturing Berlin ahead of the Red Army. Although the US and British politicians and military had not reached a consensus concerning strategic objectives in the concluding stage of the war, the Supreme Command of the Allied Expeditionary Force was not averse to taking Berlin under favourable circumstances. Thus, informing the combined Chiefs of Staff about his decision regarding the final operations on April 7, 1945, General Dwight D. Eisenhower said, "If, after the taking of Leipzig, it appeared that I can push on to Berlin at low cost, I am willing to do so." And further on, "I am the first to admit that a war is waged in pursuance of political aims, and if the combined Chiefs of Staff should decide that the Allied effort to take Berlin outweighs purely military considerations in this theatre, I would cheerfully readjust my plans and my thinking so as to carry out such an operation." In the last days of March, Stalin received Eisenhower's information on his intentions of reaching the agreed line in the Berlin sector through the US mission. It was clear from this message that it was intended to develop the offensive of the British and US forces in the northeastern direction to reach the Lübeck area, and in the southeastern direction to smash the enemy in the south of Germany. Stalin was aware that the Nazi leadership had lately become very active in seeking separate agreements with the British and US governments. In view of the hopeless situation of the German forces, it was to be expected that the Nazis would stop resisting in the West and would open the way to Berlin for the US and British forces to avoid giving it up to the Red Army. On March 27, 1945, the Reuters correspondent with the 21st Army Group, Campbell, reported on the Anglo-American offensive, stating that without encountering resistance on their way, they were moving into the heart of Germany. In mid-April 1945, American radio commentator John Grover stated that the Western Front, in fact, no longer existed. How did the Anglo-American offensive actually proceed in the Rhine area? The Nazis were known to have a weak covering force there. Having retired beyond the Rhine, the Germans could have organised serious resistance. However, this had not been done, primarily because the main forces had been transferred to the east to fight against the Soviet troops. Even at a critical time for the Ruhr Group, the German High Command had reinforced the front in the east against the Soviet troops by drawing on its western forces. At the beginning of the Anglo-American campaign, the Germans had 60 extremely weak divisions in the west, whose overall strength was equal to 26 complete divisions. The Allies had 91 full-strength divisions. The Allies enjoyed a particular superiority in the air. They could suppress any resistance both on land and in the air practically at any point by means of airstrikes. So the forcing of the Rhine by US and British troops took place under easy conditions, and the Rhine was taken practically without German resistance. Not waiting for the German Ruhr Group to be liquidated, the Allied Supreme Command rushed the main forces to the Berlin sector with the aim of reaching the Elbe. It was learned from numerous talks after the war with US, British and French generals, including Eisenhower, Montgomery, de Lattre de Tassigny, Clay, Robertson, Smith and many others, that the possibility of Allied forces taking Berlin was finally excluded only when German defences were shattered on the Oder and the Neisse by powerful Soviet artillery, mortar and air force attacks, combined with the joint onslaught of armoured units and infantry. When Eisenhower's message, stating he had decided to launch 2 offensives, in the northeast and south of Germany, and that US troops would stop at the agreed line on the Berlin sector, was received by the Stavka, Stalin described Eisenhower as a man true to his word. However, that opinion proved premature. During the Allies' landing and advance in France, close contacts were maintained between the Red Army General Staff and the US and British military missions. We often exchanged information concerning enemy troop deployment. However, as the war's end approached, we began receiving information from our allies that did not conform to the real state of affairs. And I would like to cite a letter from the Chief of General Staff, A.I. Antonov, to the head of the U.S. military mission in the USSR, Major General John R. Dean. Dear Sir, I would like you to inform General Marshall of the following. On February 20th of this year, I received a message from General Marshall that the Germans were deploying 2 groups for a counteroffensive on the Eastern Front, one in Pomerania for an attack against Torn, and another in the Vienna-Moravska Ostrava area for an offensive towards Lodz. The southern group was to include the SS 6th Panzer Army. A similar report was received on February 12th from the head of the Army section of the British military mission, Colonel Brinkman. I am extremely grateful to General Marshall for the information intended to help attain our common goals, which he so graciously offered us. At the same time, I regard it as my duty to inform General Marshall that military actions on the Eastern Front failed to confirm the information he communicated. The fighting has shown that the main group of German troops, including the SS 6th Panzer Army, was deployed not in Pomerania and not in the Moravska Ostrava area, but in the Lake Balaton region, from where the Germans advanced with the aim of reaching the Danube and force-crossing it south of Budapest. This fact shows that the information General Marshall used did not correspond to the actual course of events on the Eastern Front in March. It is not excluded that certain sources of that information were specially intended to confuse both the Anglo-American and Soviet commands, diverting the Soviet command's attention away from the area where the Germans were preparing their main offensive on the Eastern Front. Despite this, I request General Marshall, if possible, to continue communicating available information concerning the enemy. I regard it as my duty to send this message to General Marshall exclusively, so that he may draw the relevant conclusions regarding the source of this information. Please convey my respect and acknowledgement to General Marshall. Yours truly, General of the Army Antonov, Chief of Red Army General Staff, March 30th, 1945. On March 29th, summoned by the Stavka, I arrived in Moscow again with the plan of the First Byelorussian Front for the Berlin operation. The plan had been elaborated by the Front HQ and Command during March. All questions of principle had been coordinated earlier with the General Staff and the Supreme Command. This enabled us to submit a detailed plan to the Supreme Command for consideration and decision. Late in the evening, Stalin summoned me to his Kremlin office. He was alone. A conference with the members of the State Defense Committee had just ended. Offering his hand in silence, he began to speak, as if continuing a conversation interrupted just moments before. The German front in the west has collapsed completely, and apparently the Hitlerites do not want to take measures to stop the advance of Allied troops. At the same time, they are strengthening their groups on all the most important sectors against us. Here is the map. Take a look at the latest data on German troops. Lighting his pipe, Stalin went on. I think it's going to be quite a fight. Then he asked my opinion of the enemy on the Berlin sector. Producing my front reconnaissance map, I laid it down before the Supreme Commander. Stalin examined the whole operational strategic group of German troops in the Berlin strategic direction with great attention. According to our data, the Germans had 4 armies there with no fewer than 90 divisions, including 14 panzer and motorized divisions, 37 separate regiments, and 98 separate battalions. There were at least 1 million effectives, 10,400 artillery pieces and mortars, 1,500 tanks and assault guns, 3,500 combat aircraft on the Berlin sector, and an additional 200,000 strong garrison being formed in Berlin itself. When will our troops be ready to attack? Asked Stalin. I reported, the First Byelorussian Front can begin the offensive not later than in 2 weeks. The First Ukrainian Front will also be ready by that time. The Second Byelorussian Front, however, will be delayed in completely liquidating the enemy in the Danzig and Gdynia area until mid-April, and will be unable to begin the offensive from the Oder simultaneously with the First Byelorussian and the First Ukrainian Fronts. In that case, we will begin the operation without waiting for Rokossovsky's front, Stalin said. If he is a few days late, it's no tragedy. Stalin then showed me a letter from a foreign well-wisher, mentioning clandestine talks between Nazi agents and official representatives of the Allies, hinting that the Germans were proposing to stop fighting the Allies if they agreed to a separate peace. Stalin remarked, "I think Roosevelt won't violate the Yalta Accords, but as to Churchill, he wouldn't flinch at anything." Later, Antonov and I worked on refining the strategic plan for the Berlin operation. The offensive was set to begin on April 16th. The directive ordered the 1st Ukrainian Front to smash the enemy group in the Cottbus area and south of Berlin, isolate the main forces of Army Group Center from the Berlin Group, and thereby secure the offensive of the 1st Byelorussian Front from the south. Reach the Behelitz-Wittenberg line and further along the Elbe River to Dresden in 10-12 days, not later. Mount the front's main blow in the direction of Spremberg. Commit the 3rd and 4th Guards tank armies after the breakthrough in the direction of the main blow. In view of the fact that the 2nd Byelorussian Front was still heavily engaged with the German forces in areas southeast of Danzig and north of Gdynia, the Supreme Command decided to begin redeploying that front's main forces to the Oder, replacing the 1st Army of the Wojsko Polski and the 61st Army of the 1st Byelorussian Front on the Kolberg-Sweet sector not later than April 15, 18. Part of the forces of Rokossovsky's front were ordered to remain in the Danzig and Gdynia areas for mopping up operations. The aims and the objectives of the 2nd Byelorussian Front were largely determined during discussions by the Supreme Command of the General Plan of Operations on the Berlin sector. Since the 2nd Byelorussian Front was to launch the operation 4 days later, Marshal Rokossovsky was not summoned to the General Headquarters to discuss the Berlin operation. It turned out that in the first, most tense days, the 1st Byelorussian Front was to advance with an open right flank without operational and tactical cooperation with the troops of the 2nd Byelorussian Front. We seriously took into account not only the forced delay in the beginning of the 2nd Byelorussian Front's offensive, but also the difficulties it would inevitably encounter in forcing the Oder in its lower reaches. In this area, the river has 2 main channels, the East and West Oder, 150, 250 metres wide and up to 10 metres deep. We believed that the 2nd Byelorussian Front would be able to force both channels rather quickly and secure the required bridgehead, but not sooner than in 2 to 3 days. Therefore, its actual impact on the enemy north of Berlin would be felt around April 23rd, 24, that is when the 1st Byelorussian Front was to be assaulting Berlin. Of course, it would have been better to wait 5 or 6 days and begin the Berlin operation with 3 fronts simultaneously, but, as I have pointed out above, in view of the existing military-political situation, the Stavka could not put off the operation for a later date. We had very little time left before April 16th, and very many measures to be urgently taken. Troops were to be grouped, extensive logistical support provided, and large-scale operational, tactical, and special preparations of the front carried out for an exceptionally important and unusual operation such as the taking of Berlin. During the entire war, I took a direct part in many large and important offensive operations, but the coming battle for Berlin was a special, unprecedented operation. The forces of the front were to break through a zone of strong, solid defensive lines organized in depth, beginning from the Oder and ending with strongly fortified Berlin. At the approaches to Berlin, we would have to smash an enormous group of Nazi troops and capture the capital of Nazi Germany, for which the enemy would undoubtedly wage a deadly struggle. Pondering over the coming operation, I repeatedly turned my thoughts to the outstanding Battle of Moscow, when the strong enemy hordes at the approaches to the capital had been inflicting mighty blows on the Soviet forces in the defensive. I reconsidered separate episodes again and again, analyzing the mistakes of the two sides. It was my desire to take into account the experience of that most involved battle, to utilize the best in the coming operation to the most minute details, and try not to make any mistakes. The Berlin operation was the final victorious act along the 3,000 km route of fighting by the heroic Soviet forces, which had gained experience in major battles and been steeled in fierce combats. The men were eager to finish off the enemy as soon as possible and end the war. On the evening of April 1st, I called the Front Chief of Staff, Colonel General M.S. Malinin, from Moscow and said, "Everything has been approved without any special changes. We have very little time. Begin to take measures. I fly out tomorrow." These short instructions were sufficient for Malinin to immediately begin implementing the planned measures to prepare for the operation. During the war, we had not had any occasions to take cities as large and strongly fortified as Berlin. Its total area was nearly 900 square kilometers. A ramified network of underground communications enabled the enemy troops to carry out concealed maneuvers. Our reconnaissance planes photographed Berlin, all its approaches and defensive lines 6 times. The results of aerial photography, captured documents, and prisoner interrogations were used to draw up detailed schemes and maps, which were supplied to all the troops and commands down to companies. Engineering units made a scale model of the city with its suburbs, which was used in studying questions concerned with the organization of the offensive, the general assault of Berlin, and fighting in the city centre. The conferences and command exercises with maps and Berlin's scale model between April 5th and 7 were conducted very actively and in a creative spirit. Participating in these exercises were the army commanders, chiefs of staff, and members of military councils, the chief of the front political administration, artillery commanders of the armies and the front, commanders of all separate corps, and chiefs of the front's arms of the service. The front logistics chief was also present and carefully studied questions of the operation's logistical support. More detailed games and exercises were held between April 8th and 14 in the armies, corps, divisions, and units of all the arms of the service. Due to the front's rear communications being extremely drawn out, as well as the diversion of large supplies for the East Pomeranian operation, the required supplies had not been secured by the beginning of the Berlin operation. Truly heroic efforts were needed on the part of the front and army logistics personnel, and they proved worthy of their duties. In preparing for the operation, we all wondered what else to undertake in order to stun the enemy even more and smash him. Thus, the idea originated of a night attack using searchlights. It was decided to attack 2 hours before dawn. 140 anti-air searchlights were to light up enemy positions and objectives of the offensive. During preparations for the operation, the effectiveness of the searchlights was shown to the participants, and all those present were in favour of their use. The question of using the tank armies was seriously discussed during the exercises when the breaching of the enemy tactical defences on the Oder was rehearsed. It was decided to commit the tank armies to battle only after the Silo Heights were captured, on account of the strong tactical defences on these Silo Heights. Naturally, we did not count on our tank armies gaining an opportunity for operational manoeuvring after the breaching of the tactical defences, as had been the case in the previous Vistula Oder, East Pomeranian, and other operations. In those operations, the tank armies had moved far ahead and created all conditions for the rapid movement forward by the field armies. There were moments in the Vistula Oder operation, for instance, when the Second Guards tank army was up to 70 kilometres ahead of the field armies. This was not envisaged in this operation, because the distance to Berlin along a straight line was not more than 80 kilometres. Therefore, the following was provided. If the strength of the attack by the front's first echelon proved insufficient to rapidly overcome the enemy tactical defences, and the possibility of a delay arose, both tank armies would be committed to smash the enemy defence. This would reinforce the attack of the infantry armies and help complete the breakthrough of the enemy tactical defences in the Oder and Silo Heights area. It was stipulated in the Supreme Command Directive that both the 1st and the 2nd Guards tank armies would be committed to battle for an attack on Berlin from the northeast and to outflank it from the north. However, during the rehearsal of the operation, the commanding officers of the front staff and I had serious doubts that enemy defences would be successfully smashed in the offensive zone of the 8th Guards Army on the front's main sector, particularly in the area of the strongly fortified Silo Heights, which were 12 kilometres from the forward line of the German defences. Since the left flank neighbour, the 2nd Byelorussian Front, would begin the offensive later than we, any delay in breaching the enemy defences could lead to a very unfavourable operational situation. To put the front beyond the reach of chance, we decided to deploy the 1st Guards Tank Army, commanded by General M. Katukov, in a home position behind Chuikov's 8th Guards Army, so as to commit the former in the offensive zone of the 8th Guards Army in case of need. Having assumed responsibility for the change in deployment, as provided for in the Supreme Command's directive, I nevertheless reported it to the Supreme Commander. After listening to my arguments, Stalin said, "Do as you think better, you're in a better position to judge on the spot. In order to provide the necessary reinforcements for the Eastern Front by the beginning of the decisive Russian offensive, we had to disband our entire reserve army, i.e. all the infantry, panzer, artillery and special reserve units, military schools and colleges, and send their personnel to reinforce the troops." The Nazi command drew up a detailed plan for the defence of the Berlin sector, hoping that defensive battles on the Oder, the strategic forefront of Berlin, would be successful. The following measures were taken with this aim. General Busse's 9th Army, which defended the city, was reinforced with personnel and military hardware. New divisions and brigades were formed in its rear, and units on the forward line were brought up almost to full strength. Particular attention was paid to the deployment and use of tanks and assault guns in the defence. An unbroken system of defensive works, consisting of a number of uninterrupted zones with several trenches each, was built from the Oder to Berlin. The main defensive line had up to 5 continuous trenches. The enemy took advantage of natural obstacles, lakes, rivers, canals and ravines. Towns and villages were adjusted for all-around defence. Army Group Steiner was formed northeast of Berlin with the aim of attacking the flank of the First Byelorussian Front. Picked marine units were also transferred to this area. Additionally, special measures were taken to defend Berlin. The city perimeter was divided into 6 defensive sections, and a special 9th section included the centre of Berlin, with the government buildings, Imperial Chancellery, Gestapo, and Reichstag. 3 defence lines were built at the immediate approaches to the city. 1. The outer protection zone. 2. The outer defensive perimeter. 3. The inner defensive perimeter. Heavy barricades, anti-tank obstacles, obstructions and concrete structures were erected on the streets of the city. House windows were reinforced and turned into embrasures. A newly formed headquarters for Berlin's defence warned the population to prepare for street and house fighting, which would be waged on the ground and underground. It was recommended to take advantage of the subway, underground sewage system, and communications. A special order advised turning residential areas into fortresses. Every street, square, lane, house, canal, and bridge became part of the overall defence system of the city. 200 battalions of the Volkssturm, created for street fighting, underwent special training. All anti-aircraft artillery at and around Berlin was used to reinforce the city's artillery defence. More than 600 anti-aircraft artillery pieces of large and medium calibre were mounted for anti-tank and anti-personnel action. Tanks undergoing repairs were used as fire points, buried in the ground at street corners and railway bridges. Anti-tank groups, manned by members of the Hitlerjugend, the Nazi youth organisation, were armed with Faustpatronen. Over 400,000 people toiled on the defences of Berlin. Picked units of police and SS were deployed in the city, with numerous SS regiments and separate battalions brought in to defend the special section, headed by the chief of Hitler's bodyguard, Mohnke. The Nazi command expected that they would force us to lose one line after another, delay the battle, exhaust our troops, and stop them at the nearest approaches. They hoped to repeat the defensive success the Soviet armed forces had achieved at the approaches to Moscow. However, these plans were not to be realized. Events preceding the Berlin operation developed in such a way that it was impossible to conceal our intentions from the enemy. It was clear to anyone, even a layperson, that the key to Berlin lay on the Oder. The Germans expected this. General Jodl later said, "It was clear to the General Staff that the Battle of Berlin would be decided on the Oder, and for that reason the bulk of the 9th Army's troops defending Berlin were deployed on the forward line. Reserves being urgently formed were to be deployed north of Berlin for a subsequent counterattack against Marshal Zhukov's forces." Preparing for the offensive, We were fully aware that the Germans were expecting our thrust on Berlin. Therefore, the front command devised ways to make the attack as unexpected as possible for the enemy, planning to hit their defensive lines with such force that they would be stunned and crushed by masses of aircraft, tanks, artillery, and other equipment. To muster this military might in secret and in such a short time required titanic, highly skillful work. Numerous trains with artillery, mortar, and tank units moved through Poland, disguised as civilian transport carrying timber and hay. Upon arrival, the camouflage was quickly removed, and tanks, artillery pieces, and tractors were unloaded and sent to shelters. Empty trains returned to the east, replaced by more military shipments. The front was reinforced with heavy guns, mortars, tractors, and supplies. By March 29th, when the last shots were fired in Pomerania, artillery and tanks moved south under strict camouflage. Woods and groves along the Oder were filled with troops, and tens of thousands of guns and mortars of various calibers were deployed on the Berlin sector. It was necessary to equip firing positions, dugouts for crews, and ammunition pits for every gun. By day, the positions appeared deserted. At night, thousands of men worked silently despite spring mud and subsoil waters. In the morning, no trace of this labour could be seen, thanks to careful camouflage. Long lines of tanks, artillery, and supply trucks moved at night to avoid detection. Over 7 million shells had to be available by the operation's start. Simultaneously, 25 bridges and 40 ferry crossings were built across the Oder despite constant enemy fire. The area was protected by anti-aircraft artillery and fighter patrols. The enemy tried to destroy the crossings with bombing raids, missiles, and floating mines, but damage was repaired quickly. Thousands of kilometres of telephone lines were laid both underground and above ground. On the main attack sector, there were 270 artillery pieces per kilometre of the front line. Alongside operational and material preparations, extensive political work was conducted to ready the troops. Educational work inspired by Lenin's leadership increased party consciousness, and many soldiers joined the Communist Party during this final period of the war. At a party meeting in the 416th Rifle Division of the 5th Shock Army, both communists and non-party soldiers spoke of their resolve to finish off fascism. Lieutenant General Konstantin Telegin, member of the Front Military Council, directed party political work with energy, visiting many units and urging them to perform feats of arms for the motherland. Additionally, troops were educated on how to behave toward Germany's civilian population, avoiding undesirable actions despite personal suffering at Nazi hands. It had already been determined that the First Byelorussian Front would smash the Berlin Group and take Berlin with assistance from part of the forces of the First Ukrainian Front. Operational cooperation between the First Byelorussian and First Ukrainian Fronts was coordinated by the Stavka. Thus, during the course of the operation, the Stavka specified cooperation between the group on the right flank of the First Byelorussian Front and the 4th Tank Army of the First Ukrainian Front. Their objective was to reach the Potsdam, Rathenau, and Brandenburg area to close the operational encirclement of the entire Berlin enemy group. It was decided, when planning the operation, to strike an auxiliary blow with the 69th and the 33rd Armies from the Frankfurt am Oder area, south of the Frankfurt-Berlin Railway, in the general direction of Bernsdorf. The goal was to prevent the enemy's 9th Army from retreating to Berlin after the breakthrough by the 1st Byelorussian and the 1st Ukrainian fronts on the Oder and the Neisse. The Stavka ordered the commander of the 1st Ukrainian Front to attack from the Cottbus area with part of its right wing towards Wendisch-Buchholz. The goal was to cut off the 9th Army from Berlin and rout it jointly with the left wing of the 1st Byelorussian Front. By the strikes of the 69th, 33rd and 3rd Armies of the 1st Byelorussian Front, along with the 3rd Guards, 13th, part of the 3rd Guards tank, and 28th Armies of the 1st Ukrainian Front, the entire 200,000-strong German southeastern group of General Buss's 9th Army was cut off from Berlin and soon routed. The important role of the 1st Guards Tank Army, 1st Byelorussian Front, should be emphasized. It reached Berlin's southeastern outskirts, blocking the Ninth Army's escape routes to Berlin. This made it easier for the 8th Guards Army to fight in the city. At this point, I would like to recall more or less consecutively how the historic Berlin operation unravelled. Reconnaissance was carried out 2 days before the beginning of the offensive along the entire front line. For 2 days, on April 14th and 15, 32 recon groups consisting of up to 1 reinforced rifle battalion each were reconnoitering in force to reveal the enemy fire defence system, his deployment, and to probe the strong and weak points in the defence zone. This reconnaissance in force also pursued another aim. It was in our interests to force the Germans to deploy more men and equipment on the forward line, so they would be hit by all the front's artillery and mortars during the artillery barrage before the offensive on April 16th. The reconnaissance on April 14th and 15 was accompanied by strong artillery fire, including large-caliber guns. The enemy mistook the reconnaissance for the beginning of our offensive. Suffice it to say that some German units were dislodged from their forward positions as a result of action by our recon groups, and almost the entire German artillery took part in repelling the recon group attacks. The aim we had pursued had been attained. The enemy rushed his reserves to the second positions. However, our troops stopped their advance and dug in. This perplexed the enemy command. As it was learned later, some German commanders decided that our offensive had failed. During the war, the enemy had become used to the fact that we usually began our artillery barrage before an attack in the morning, as infantry and tank attacks were restricted to daylight. We decided to take advantage of the enemy's expectation of no night attacks. Late at night, a few hours before the artillery and air barrage, I set out for the observation post of 8th Guards Army Commander, General Chuikov. Along the way, I met many commanders of rifle and tank units, including the 1st Guards Tank Army Commander, General Katukov, and his Chief of Staff, General Shalin. All were checking the combat readiness of their troops again in every detail. I was pleased by the foresight shown by Generals Katukov and Shalin. It turned out that they had sent their unit commanders in the first echelon of the tank army to the observation posts of the corps commanders of the 8th Guards Army the previous morning, to coordinate the details of cooperation for committing their units into the breach. From the 1st Guards Tank Army Command Post, I called HQ of S.I. Bogdanov's 2nd Guards Tank Army. General Radzievsky, the 2nd Guards Tank Army Chief of Staff, informed me that the commanders were up in front, coordinating with Kuznetsov's people for the upcoming operation. I marvelled at how much the commanders had honed their operational and tactical skills throughout the war. I arrived at General Chuikov's observation post with member of the Military Council K.F. Telegin and Front Artillery Commander 6 Kazakov. It was 3 a.m. Moscow time. Checks of combat readiness were being completed in all units. Everything was done efficiently, without overconfidence, and with a clear focus on the seriousness of the upcoming battle.